Hey friends, welcome back for today's conversation regarding theological development, Christian theology, theological development during the Great War. Yesterday we talked about what that looked like in Germany, how that changed and was reinforced during the war. Today we're going to look at some of the information out there about what happens in the United States, how the United States, how ministers and professors in the United States speak of war, speak of who Jesus is, and how that correlates to how they should respond to war. I mentioned just a little bit about what it looks like in yesterday's video, just to kind of give you a comparison and let you know that there are differences between how that happens in Germany and how it happens in the United States. Let's start by doing a bit of a short recap on what the Christological outlook, the understanding of who Jesus was in the United States in the lead up to the war. Talked about this a few videos back, but just kind of as a reminder. In the United States, the way in which people were most interested in Jesus came down to not identity, not who he was, not a question of soteriology, the salvation. It became a question of Jesus' character, what type of person Jesus was. And so, though people would have that conversation for all sorts of different external reasons, different influences around the outside, the point that they all kind of managed to agree on was that Jesus was a man's man, a manly man. Everywhere from Harry Emerson Fosdick's book, which I have here over my shoulder, called The Manhood of the Master, to Billy Sunday's Jesus the Scrapper. Even though those two guys come from very different understandings of Jesus' identity and Jesus' nature and how Jesus works, the point they agreed on, even though they started at two very different ends, was that Jesus was a man's man. Obviously, that has significant influence when the United States does finally enter into the war in 1917. I want to do a little conversation on the history aspect of this before I talk about the theological developments of the war. I am more than happy to argue that the United States was in the war well before we officially declared war on anyone. It has been said that we are a nation of war profiteers, and I find that a fairly accurate description of us. Going into the First World War, the United States had long had isolationist policies. There were a number of, a decent portion of America's population was concerned when we got into the Spanish-American War because it broke long-standing non-interventionist tendencies. No less a great president than George Washington cautioned against involvement in Europe's wars, and that had been American political gospel for, over 100 years, or almost 100 years, I guess, if we're looking at 1898 from the time that Washington gives the speech towards the end of his, or after the end of his 2 terms as president. Yeah, because that would have been 1800. All right, cool. So anyway, all that is neither here nor there at this moment, just a little scatterbrained thought. So if you're one of the minority, like Teddy Roosevelt was, trying to move the United States to war, you've got a lot of, you've got a century's worth of national narrative to overcome. Woodrow Wilson's platform for his second term, his big campaign slogan was "He kept us out of war." It seemed to work. If I'm trying to remember, he ended up winning the vast majority of states. Obviously, he won the presidency, but it wasn't really close. And there are all sorts of conversations we can have around the personality of Wilson. There are plenty of more capable and competent historians than I that argue both sides of whether or not Wilson was really as idealistic as he comes across, really wanted to stay out of the war, or if really he wanted to be in the middle of the war and just had to figure out a way to do it while looking good There are good arguments on both sides, and I'm not going to pretend to have the knowledge to weigh in on which one is right. But I will say that Christians in the United States, because of the national and because of national focus and Christianity's focus on the manliness of Jesus and the manliness of men, were primed to create soldiers before the outbreak of the war. And by the time 1917 gets here, the United States has a vested interest on making sure that the Central Powers lose the war, because the United States has loaned a significant amount of money to Russia and to England and to France, and some of the smaller countries that are fighting on their side. So once you have invested that much money and are making that much money off of the products that you are sending to them, that they're turning around and spending the money you loan them on your products, you have a vested interest in making sure that your side wins. People always point to the sinking of the Lusitania, Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare, as being immoral, but we're kidding ourselves if we don't recognize that plenty of immoral acts were taking place on all sides of this war. Germany's and Britain's and France's, and everybody commits atrocities during war. This war is by no means any different. In the United States, early on, any conversation that takes place on whether or not the United States should get into the war also comes with a conversation on whose side we should get into the war on. The U.S. is a country of immigrants. Immigration is the reason that a large percentage of the population that's there in the early 1900s is there. And two of the biggest places people have immigrated from are Germany and Ireland. A number of the people who have immigrated from Ireland are not interested in seeing the U.S. partner up with Great Britain. The United States has already fought 2 wars with Great Britain between the Revolution and the War of 1812, so there's not a lot of love lost there anyway. And then, German immigrants are not real excited about going to war with Germany, where they still have friends and relatives. If you're talking about first or second generation immigrants, then you've got a lot to overcome there. So all of that plays a role. And specifically, I'll talk about a guy towards the end of today whose life and writings paints a pretty good picture of what that struggle looks like. A guy named Reinhold Niebuhr, who I referenced a few videos back. Thankfully, he kept a journal as he was going through kind of the personal struggles he faced as a German American and a minister in the German synod that he was a part of, in a church that still kept its German practice, German language, German name, and then also having to appear patriotic so that he was not looked down on in the process. But we'll talk more about that just as a way of reminding us that even though we're talking specifically about how Christianity and how language around Christ influences people's responses, it is by no means ever the only influence. And Niebuhr is a good example of what that looks like in practice. All right, so by 1917, when the United States enters the war, they've raised a generation of young men who are now coming to fighting age, who have been told over and over and over about Jesus' manliness. So the language is already there, ready for ministers and propagandists and professors to send young men off to war in the name of Christ. I've mentioned it already in this video. The German army was not some horribly atrocious... The German nation was not some horribly atrocious nation in the First World War committing atrocities that vastly measure the ones committed by others. This is a war that starts not because of morality or land grabbing, but because everybody had kind of been anticipating it. Some people wanted to go ahead and get it over. And this, assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Serbian nationalists kind of sparks this small thing in the Balkans that grows to be a big thing because of all of these, promises back and forth over who's going to do what if. It's not like the German army invaded France or Belgium, and then everyone else reacted. All of the major players in this war who get started in 1914, like basically the moment Franz Ferdinand is assassinated, and begin wondering if this is going to be it. A month later, when Serbia issues this absolutely impossible to keep, or when Austria-Hungary issues this absolutely impossible to keep kind of ultimatum to Serbia, all of the nations mobilize their militaries, like everything is moving at once. All just trying to reinforce, this is not an at-fault war, where you can say that one nation is predominantly at fault and everybody else was just defending or doing the right thing in response. Everybody does everything wrong at the start of this war because they don't know what it's going to look like. I bet if you take all of the people who go to war in 1914, who move their countries to war in 1914, and show them what it's going to look like in 1918 at the end of the war, or in 1920 after the peace agreement is signed, or 1946 after all of the fallout from the peace agreements and power shifts that take place in the process, they would happily go back, not declare war, and find a different way to handle things. But they just don't know. I lost my train of thought. So that's just kind of a wrap-up of where the world is. So with the United States entering the war, you've got plenty of people in the country who would pick different sides should they go to war. Wilson is no idiot, sees this, keeps the country out of war because he doesn't want to deal with that deep a division among his country and the people that he's leading. By the time it becomes obvious that the U.S. is getting in, Germany has sent Mexico this telegram. Arthur Zimmerman, who sent it, when it's published, could have kept his mouth shut and everybody would have felt that it was just something created by a newspaper in the United States to, move people towards war. Like an idiot, he admits that he sent it and it's true, and then justifies by saying, well, these are just, promises in case. You understand that, right? And of course, nobody in the United States understands that. German Americans are particularly embarrassed in this process, and like Niebuhr, start taking measures to appear hyper-patriotic so that no aspersions can be cast against them, no suspicion can rest on them. And the United States moves to war. And I want to start by letting you know that very quickly some of the biggest proponents of war and the absolute defeat of the Central Powers are the ministers in the pulpits. And there are some particularly notable ones that stand out during this time. One is a guy named Lyman Abbott, who's a well-known minister across the United States. He calls for an all-out crusade against Germany in the name of Christ. He calls the German army Satan's army, and he writes an article that's entitled "To Love is to Hate," where he explains that it is a Christian responsibility to hate Germany, to hate the German people, and to respond against their actions in hatred. That's what Christians should do. Obviously, I think there's a lot wrong with that, but that's what he begins to publicize, not just to his congregation, but as an influential minister in the country, publishes articles that go into newspapers, that being one of them, that begin to nudge Christians toward the understanding that the Christian response is to go kill Germans. Another Congregationalist minister in the same vein as Lyman Abbott is a guy named Newell Dwight Hillis. He goes even a step further than Abbott's "To Love is to Hate." You remember, if you know your history, that this is a time where eugenics is taking off, the belief in the purity of people based on getting rid of any and all considered inferior. He suggests that maybe the Christian response would be to sterilize every soldier in the German army, segregate off German women so they can't reproduce, and just get rid of the German bloodline. He also is the one who suggests in a sermon to his congregation that if Jesus were born into the world of 1917, 1918, where America is entering the war, that Jesus would be the first one at the draft office preparing to go bayonet the Hun. I think basically the quote is that Jesus would arm himself with bayonet and grenade and bomb and rifle without any hesitation in order to deal death to Satan's army. Those are two very extreme examples, Abbott and Hillis, but that's not to say that they're the only ones like them. If I had included every quote and every person that suggested something along the same lines with the same rhetoric as those two, the book that I ended up writing, the thesis I ended up writing would have had to have been done in volumes. There are literally hundreds of other ministers saying the exact same thing at the exact same time. That's not to say that everyone took it that far, but even your more moderate voices are voices who are very much anti-German, very much pro-war. There's an article in the Christian Century written by William Barton called "Was Jesus a Pacifist?" that directly attacked pacifist elements in the church in the United States. He portrays Jesus' triumphal entry as a belligerent war measure and an act of invasion in order to convince his readers that war is not only a good thing in this case, but the thing that Jesus would do because it was the thing Jesus had done. He argues that Jesus' gentleness was, quote, tremendously militant, which is an odd phrase that I had trouble understanding in the context with which he used it. And the best explanation I can come up with is, even though there was 100 ways better to say what he was trying to get across, that was the one that gave the image that he wanted. Just where they sit. Charles Sharp contributes an article to the Christian Century 4 months after the United States entered the war, where he writes, "It is precisely because Jesus died victoriously upon Calvary that we are called to die victoriously upon the fields in Europe. In the cause of human liberty, both are holy ground." This is a conversational article. Another participant in the written conversation, B.H. Brunner, completely rewrites the epilogue to John's Gospel, what we read as "In the beginning was the Word was with God." He rewrites it and writes this. B.H. Brunner writes, "I think that epilogue, would read something like this. And God the Father, in the form of his Son Jesus Christ, identified himself with humanity in its great fight against sin, digging himself into the trenches with men who are fighting in the supreme struggle against mammon." What Brunner is suggesting there is that the sin of the world has taken root and is found primarily and predominantly in German greed and German militarism. I don't think I have to add much for you to understand that that is a massive stretch and not at all what John is getting at when he introduces his gospel. But if you have come to understand Jesus primarily as a man's man, the manly redeemer, as a soldier and combatant before his time, then you can take what you believe to be true and write it into what already exists in a way that makes you feel better, in a way that makes you feel right, in a way that makes you feel comfortable with the choices that you're already going to make anyway. C.E. Jefferson is another interesting voice. His collection of lectures given at Vanderbilt in 1918 was a huge source in my writing. He was a great voice to see, trying to balance out all of these conversations. In some ways, he tries to present his lectures as a moderation of all of these different conversations that are happening. He doesn't do a very good job of it. His thoughts bleed through immediately. There's absolutely no lack of bias in his words very quickly as he moves his way through. And he gives voice to an idea that arises in the trenches on the American end of the battle that arise in the trenches on the American end of the battle in a way that they don't anywhere else. And that is an idea that when soldiers die on the field in battle, they automatically go to heaven, never mind what happened at any point before then. Here's what he writes about that. When you pass into the trenches, you are still in the company of the innocent. These soldiers are all young men. They had nothing to do with this war. They did not create the forces which caused it. They did not frame the legislation which made it possible. Their advice was not asked in any country. Like sheep, they have been driven to the slaughter. So you can hear there that Jefferson is already using the same sacrificial language that is used of Jesus. You see that become all the more clear whenever you... Sorry, I'm trying to find the quotes that... there we go. That continue this conversation. The idea of instant salvation for American soldiers in the trenches is ubiquitous once you make it to the front lines themselves, and any voices that suggest otherwise are immediately drowned out or shouted down. In the first 9, and there's... I get why people would want it to be that simple, because making it that simple means you don't have to deal with the complexities and your own complicity in what is happening to the young men who have gone to war. Stars and Stripes is the publication by the American Expeditionary Force that goes into the hands of soldiers. They repeatedly publish articles that suggest that instant salvation is there for any and every single soldier who dies in the trenches, no ifs, ands, or buts. Anytime they run into a chaplain, anytime they run into a chaplain who is suggesting otherwise, they do their best to get him off of foreign soil and back home, or they make fun of him in publication in order to make him look like make him look wrong. So here's the quote that is written by the editors in Stars and Stripes. "He who loseth his life in a righteous cause shall find it," written to a chaplain who suggested that maybe instant salvation wasn't a thing. Sorry, let me start that again. "He who loseth his life in a righteous cause shall find it, good chaplain. Jesus Christ himself promised it." So you can hear there the editors editing Jesus' own words in order to make sure that it is understood that fighting the Germans in this battle is a right and righteous cause, one that marks good and evil. And I would, again, remind you of what we've talked about repeatedly, that is absolutely not the case in the First World War. These are nations that all march to war against each other at the same time for a lot of the same reasons. The Central Powers and the Allied Powers are both recruiting neutral nations to join the war on their side, promising them territory and money from the victory spoils when they overtake the land and the governments of those that are fighting against. Nobody comes out of this looking good, and nobody really gets into it for a righteous cause. They get into it for political and personal ones. But you can't just say that once you've already gone to war. You have to make the other side look evil. You have to make them look like the beast that you have portrayed them to be, so that, because the honesty of, we're fighting because it seemed like a good idea, or we're fighting because we want to secure our loans, doesn't really suggest that you're in a righteous battle. Against the same soul saver chaplains, the editors of Stars and Stripes write this: "Because they, those soul saver chaplains, have never really comprehended the teachings of the master they profess, they cannot know that the smiling, cussing, battle-stained doughboy needs no help in saving his soul. They, the chaplains, cannot know that in offering and spending his life in a righteous cause, the American soldier finds it. They can never comprehend that in saving the soul of the world, the soldier saves his own." The editors at Stars and Stripes, when it comes to religious language and Christological imperative, never miss an opportunity to compare the soldiers to as close to Jesus as they can. This is, again, something that you don't see to this extent in any of the other combatant nations that go into this battle, even the ones who have national churches like Europe, like Russia, like Germany, like Italy. They don't make this jump because there is some space between their understanding of who Jesus is and their understanding of what it means to be a man in this world. In the United States, there is no space between those two things because of all of this conversation that has taken place around the previous 4 decades about Jesus' manliness. And so as soon as you have decided that the most important aspect of Jesus is Jesus' manliness, then you have decided that the most important thing that you can do as a man, or that you can encourage your young men to do, is to go do something as manly as possible, like war. I don't agree with any of that, but I can tell you that that's exactly what is taking place in the United States as we move towards war with and in Europe. So I wanted to, those just a couple of quotes there to give you an idea of what this looked like in the United States in trenches propaganda. Now I want to wrap up by talking about that guy I mentioned at the beginning, Reinhold Niebuhr. So Niebuhr is, I put this down and now I need to pick it back up. Niebuhr is an interesting case study for a number of reasons, but mostly because, and you may remember this guy if you are on the older end of our listener scale, until Richard Nixon kind of pulls Billy Graham in and makes him the evangelical voice of the nation. The predominant kind of religious Christian national voice is Reinhold Niebuhr. He's the one who is regularly appearing on TV, gets the interviews, is on radio, and has significant religious influence as kind of a national voice for Christianity. I mentioned it earlier. Niebuhr, by blood, is German. He is young at the time that war breaks out. He has just become an ordained minister in the German Evangelical Synod of North America. So he's in a small denomination with its roots in Germany, with the name German in its title. He is of German descent, and when the United States declares war on Germany, as you can imagine, to be a German in the United States is challenging. People immediately question your loyalties, and you either have to learn to deal with all of that's coming your direction, or you have to explain your way around it. You have to live in such an overt patriotic manner that it's no longer questioned. And Niebuhr has to deal with all of these things. So he writes this: "Being a German American, I was more than ordinarily patriotic during the war. My jealous love for my own nation," meaning the United States at this point, not Germany, "created such a resentment against the members of the German group who spoke critically of my country, the United States, that I forgot my pacifism and was driven into the arms of the war enthusiasts." He also goes on to say something to the effect of, after visiting a military training camp, he writes, "Out at Funston, I watched a bayonet practice. It was enough to make me feel like a brazen hypocrite for being in this thing, even in a rather indirect way. I cannot bring myself to associate with the pacifists. Perhaps if I were not of German blood, I could." If you really look at what Niebuhr writes, he is very much in theology a pacifist. Yet, because of personal reasons, because of his German heritage and the challenges that come with being German in the United States while fighting in Germany, he decides that he can't be a pacifist in this case. And that's just a reminder That's just a way to recognize that we have more than one influence on us in any given conversation. If the United States is at war with Great Britain, Niebuhr probably feels more comfortable to be a vocal pacifist, but because he's a German American in a German evangelical synod in the United States, he doesn't feel the freedom to do that without causing problems for himself and his church members. So just as a reminder that even though we're talking about the role that Christianity plays in this conversation and the role that Christians' understanding of who Jesus is plays in this conversation, those are not, by any stretch of the imagination, the only influences in this conversation. All right, that wraps up today's chapter. I think this one may have been a shade shorter because there's more to this chapter in the book that I wrote than what we talked about today. Tomorrow, I'm going to talk about my church tradition specific struggle in the lead up to World War I. The kind of vocal national leaders for the churches of Christ take all sorts of directions in the process, and there's a significant struggle that churches experience during because of the decision to go to war. In the process, Christian colleges open, close, relocate, change boards, and reopen. All sorts of things go haywire, and it's a fascinating, though it will, like this one, hopefully be a little bit shorter conversation to take place. All right, that wraps us up for today. Thanks for joining in. Share this with your friends, and again, if you are at all interested, pick up my book on Amazon or on Barnes & Noble, or read it on Amazon on Kindle Unlimited. All the money made off of this book during the coming month or two will go back to our church here in Spokane, Washington, as we try to bridge the gap at a time when we're not able to get together in person, and also as we still try to meet the needs of the community that's around us. All right, thanks, and see you tomorrow.